EU banks.
What we aim to achieve in TTIP is that these regulatory agencies coordinate more closely with each other, so that where safety levels are similar, double testing and double inspections can be avoided in future to save companies money.
So what we've seen from the leaked chapters and sort of leaked information is what they're pushing for is a system of mutual recognition. So that is where you say, look, our ways of regulating are different. However, we believe they achieve the same outcome ultimately. So if a product is made in the US under that regulatory system, if we've said that we accept that that regulatory system has produced a sufficient outcome that we believe that product to be safe, that can now be imported here without having to be looked at again by our regulators. That's what the EU are pushing for, especially we've seen a leaked food safety draft proposal. So that would mean that when it comes to importing and exporting food, we would say in the EU, accept that the US regulators have checked the food over there, they're verified it's safe, so when it comes over to the EU, we won't have to do as many port of entry inspections because they cost a lot of money. So it'll save us money and be great for everyone. And that's completely fine if the systems are the same and equivalent. But we know, for example, in food safety, the one there that they're not. And that can also be applied to other sectors such as chemicals. You know, the systems are different and they result in tangibly different outcomes.
One of the key differences between the regulatory regimes in the European Union and in the USA is that we in Europe base our regulations on what is called the precautionary principle. And the idea of the precautionary principle is basically, if you can't prove that a chemical substance is safe for introduction into commercial usage, then you can't introduce it. In the USA, exactly the opposite pertains. So if the government can't prove beyond all reasonable doubt that a chemical is unsafe, then it's okay for business to introduce that into commercial usage. And that leads to disparities, for example, in cosmetics. In cosmetics, in the European Union, there are 1,300 substances banned for use in cosmetics. In the States, it's just 12.
We've had EU Commission officials saying to us privately that, look, there is nothing positive in this agreement for the so-called REACH directive, which is about what chemicals are allowed in the European Union at all. You know, that we really need to keep a very close eye on what's happening. And one of the things that's also being put on the table is this sort of regulatory committee. Will look at certain of this regulation, look at what might be changed, what might not. And, you know, there are a lot of us that have invested a lot of time. A lot of public interest has gone into getting the legislation that we already have, for example, on chemicals. And we don't want to see that undermined in corporate interests.
So the idea that during the negotiations we could change REACH, that's, I mean, that seems to be out of the scope of these negotiations, but I think we should have the courage to have a fresh look at what we have been doing in the past as well. But that, I believe, is really part of the living agreement, the living part of the agreement.
We had a leak a year ago about something called a regulatory council. And the idea behind this is that in addition to signing TTIP now, there would be this body that lives on beyond it that would have a regulatory role for the transatlantic space. And whenever a new regulation in the US or the EU were proposed, this regulatory council will actually have the right to look at it and possibly veto it on the grounds that it would damage transatlantic trade. So it is placing transatlantic trade above all other considerations. So you couldn't bring in an environmental regulation, however laudable it might be, if it caused profits to diminish in transatlantic trade, because the regulatory council would have the power to say, this is not good for trade.
Trade considerations often run contrary to public health considerations, because trade considerations are largely just considered as, will this cost businesses more to do in the short term? You know, when environmental public health policy is more what needs to be done to protect the population's health or to protect the environment in the long term. So those pressures sort of come head to head here, and we just think that with this proposed regulatory cooperation council where businesses will be able to lobby, we think that it will probably lead to a weakening going forward. And at a time of planetary emergency where we've got to address the climate crisis, we've got to be bringing in needed regulation to address market failure effectively, massive market failure that is climate change. Having further obstructions to this and further sort of leverage to be used against this and formalising the lobbying process for big companies is just a step in the wrong direction.
The way that regulation is made if it's made in the US, is that there's really big business input right the way through, which blocks regulation most of the time, and a harmonising of that methodology with ours with theirs would be really dangerous for us.
It's also worth pointing out that there are many US groups